Right then, so in our first session together, we looked at this idea of grow on purpose. And so above all else, guard your heart. Being intentional around the inner world, the center of your being. And this afternoon, I think we're planning a little bit of an interview and feedback and some practicality around that. So hopefully we'll unpack that a little bit further. This session, I want to just nudge that a wee bit more and talk about growing for purpose. So adding another little layer to the journey and with us. So I want to read you something from the Gospel of Luke. Again, if you want to follow, please feel free. I'm going to read from Luke chapter 2, and I'm going to read from verse 41. Some of you will be sort of familiar with this story. It's a unique Lucan story. No other gospel writer has this, and it really gives us a beautiful, unique insight into the development of Jesus. Verse 41 of Luke chapter 2 says this: Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. And if you can, flick over to chapter 3, just a couple of verses, down to verse 21. And it says this: When all the people were being baptized, Jesus was baptized too. And as he was praying, heaven was opened, and the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." Now Jesus himself was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. He was the son, so it was thought, of Joseph. Amazing, unique and beautiful passage. Luke chapter 2 passage leading into the baptism of Jesus. And I want to highlight one particular verse that I want to foil off in this session and build upon. And it's this. And it's a striking statement. It says that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. Now, really easy to miss that. In the rush of following the trajectory of Jesus' life, it's really easy to miss this powerful and transformational piece of detail. So we are rushing towards the baptism where Jesus gets filled with the Spirit and begins his 3-year amazing life, world-changing ministry. And that's the bit that draws everybody's eye. We want to get to the hot stuff. Let's get to the cool stuff. Let's get to Jesus doing his amazing stuff. But actually, Dr. Luke gives us detail before we get there on how Jesus got there. Jesus didn't just arrive at his ministry position. He arrived there through a process. And Dr. Luke, apart from any other gospel writer, gives us this bit of detail about Jesus, that Jesus grew, coming off the back of this amazing temple experience. He goes back home to Nazareth, and he grew in wisdom, in stature, in favor with God and with men. And the word grow there is fascinating. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, and you can check this out for yourself, it's the third time we come across the word to grow in certainly English translations. And the first one is in Luke chapter 1 verse 80, where it talks about John, who becomes John the Baptist. It says, "And the child grew." Chapter 2 verse 40, it tells us the child Jesus grew. And then in 252, it says Jesus grew again. And the problem is, if you just follow that in an English Bible, the translation, we don't see the fact that Dr. Luke has subtly changed the word. profoundly changed the word. So in chapter 1, verse 80, and in chapter 2, verse 40, the word used there is the sort of word you would use to grow of someone growing naturally. So it's that idea, the child's healthy, the child's going to grow sort of idea. In chapter 2, verse 52, Luke introduces a whole new different word. And the word is really stunning. It's a beautiful word. The idea of that word is literally would be the forward cut. And he uses that word in such a way that Jesus is doing this in a continuous motion. It's not just a one-off action, it's a continuous idea. Now strictly defining that word is difficult for us, but maybe if I give you a picture, it will help the idea. So the idea behind this word is really summed up in the concept of cutting a path. So if me and you were out for a walk and we wanted to go somewhere that there wasn't a path to, in this weather we might get our snow shovels out. In England we would get our machetes out and we would cut a path across the field. Now, as we are cutting the path, we are prokoptoing. We are literally, intentionally making a path to somewhere. Are you with me? And in this picture here, that's the idea. So there is a perfectly normal path you could take on that picture. You just walk round. But some bright spark has decided, let's go across. And they've cut a path right across the circle. And that's the idea of this word. To deliberately and intentionally go somewhere. Now think about this. So here's what Luke is, we've just had Jesus in the temple and an amazing experience. He goes back to his home village. And what does Luke tell us he does? Luke tells us this. Jesus deliberately and intentionally cuts a path towards somewhere. He's doing something intentionally. He's growing on purpose. So Jesus grew intentionally, and he grew on purpose. So Jesus, Luke is telling us, didn't just arrive. He didn't just arrive at the baptism, God in flesh, here I am, ready to go. He arrives because he's done something. He arrives because he's grown. He's arriving because when no one was looking, when nobody was bothered, when nobody was interested, Jesus was cutting a path. Jesus was getting up every day and making a decision to grow. Now, let me just be really vulnerable with you. This verse has revolutionized my commitment to personal development. So when I stumbled across this idea probably about 15 years ago, it was literally a eureka moment. It was a jaw-dropping moment. I saw Jesus differently. So I've always believed Jesus is the Son of God, God in flesh, absolutely never really moved away from that revelation as a child. I've got that, even though it makes my head hurt to understand that. I've sort of got that. My struggle was all with the human development of Jesus, and here was Dr. Luke giving me this clue, that Jesus, even though he was God in flesh, as a man, made intentional decisions to grow. And we'll look at the areas in which he grows in a moment. That one revelation has transformed, at a revelatory way, has transformed my personal experience. So I've written some stuff on this. I'm so passionate about it because I now make deliberate, intentional decisions to grow, not simply because it's a good idea, but because I came to a revelation, it was a Jesus idea. It's a Bible idea. It's not just like a secular idea that we've stolen. This is a Bible idea that is modeled by Jesus himself. That Jesus makes, as a 12-year-old, a deliberate decision to grow in 4 key areas. And we'll come back to those 4 key areas in a moment. So what does this teach us? It teaches us a powerful idea. That growth is a decision. Over the years, I've met people and they've put their growth or lack of growth maybe down to various factors. And of course, there are many factors that influence our lives. And you are people that will understand that sort of conversation. But when you really distill everything down, growth, in my opinion, is a decision. It's something I decide to do or not. Now, I can be in an environment that respects that decision more, that empowers that decision more, and it allows a world that supports and celebrates that sort of decision. Or I can live in a world that doesn't do that so much, and so it's a bit tougher. But whatever world we're in, we can grow. Let me just say that Jesus did most of his growing in a village that was so small it wasn't on the map of its day. So if you want to be a world-renowned theological scholar, you don't live in Nazareth. So Nazareth was probably a village of less than 300 people. If we went back to a first century coffee shop, got some Wi-Fi and Googled Nazareth, Nazareth would go where? Or Google would go where? Because it wasn't on its map. It was literally off the trading route. And probably one of the reasons that Jesus grew up there was because Joseph wanted a safe place away from the prying eyes of Herod. So what does he do? He picks an off the road, off the map place. And Jesus grows up there. Jesus grew deliberately and intentionally in a world that wasn't on its map. And that's a profound encouragement to me. If Jesus can grow in a village of less than 300 people that Google couldn't find, I can grow wherever I am. Come on, are you with me? I can grow wherever I am. Now what Westside Keen's Church is trying to do is create a culture that will honor that decision, encourage that decision, resource that decision, promote that decision. Guys, I'm going to go to the handheld. Is that okay? Can you unclip me? Yeah. Just I'm getting a bit distracted. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Sorry about that. I was just getting, do you know when you're fiddling with your ear more than concentrating on what you're saying? Sorry about that. As attractive as my ear is, there we are. So actually, growth is a decision. What this church is trying to create with weekends like this is a culture that honors that, resources that, promotes that, encourages that. So actually, then, in a world like this, there is really no excuse for us. And I try to help my own world remove the excuse. Now I know, please don't hear what I'm not saying. I know some people live in very difficult environments. I get that. So I do appreciate that. So I'm not being harsh or cruel. But what I'm trying to say to them is this. Look, wherever you live, you can still grow. We can help and support you to grow. And the reason I'm able to say that is because there is a biblical mandate for that idea. Jesus grows up in a village that's minuscule. The little synagogue that Jesus announces in Luke 4, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, is floor space smaller than this stage. Tiny little place. And yet from a tiny little place, he changed the world. Now, of course, the lazy answer to that is, well, that's because he was God. Doesn't matter where God's going to live, he's going to rock the world, right? Well, yes and no. Luke is trying to lead us on a journey to promote the humanity of Jesus in the most profound way without denying his deity. He's saying Jesus is absolutely fully God, but he grows in a world that is militating against his growth. That actually a world that won't promote the growth that he's committed to. So growth is a decision. I love this idea from Miller. He says, leaders choose to grow or not to grow. Both decisions are ultimately deliberate. Now, I'm sort of preaching to the converted here. The fact that you're here on a Saturday morning when you could be doing a million other things is probably an indicator you want to grow, and probably an indicator you are growing, and I absolutely, totally commend that to you. But this idea of growth, it's not just a decision, it is a relentless, continuous process. And that's the other idea behind the word. It's not just that Jesus grew intentionally, he grew continuously. And I love that. That's helped me so much. That we never want to get to the stage in our lives as spiritual leaders where we think, hey, you have arrived at your destination.
Because the minute we think we've arrived, we stop growing. And when that happens, we start to get in trouble, don't we? We start to cut ourselves off from the world around us. I believe the choice is the ultimate test of our culture. So whatever your belief system is, the ultimate test of it is the choices you make around it. So the choices you are making about yourself, the choices you're making about your world that you influence is really the ultimate test of the stuff you believe. And because in my journey, I've come to really believe this stuff. It's something I'm really committed to. So I'm trying to make intentional decisions to expose myself to a world that will help me to grow in order to honor God in all that I'm called to. So what helps us to grow? Well, I think a sense of purpose is always helpful. And I think we see this in the life of Jesus. Tucked away here, so I'm going to use Jesus as the example. The problem with using Jesus as the example is it's Jesus. And so lots of lovely Christians back off this example because, well, he's Jesus and I'm not. He's God and I'm not. But actually, remember, Luke is taking us on the human journey. He's taking us on the growth that Jesus is making as a man. And there's this interesting phrase within the text. When his parents catch up with him, he says to them, "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" Some translations have about my father's business. And the reason for the apparent contradiction is because neither the idea of business or house is in the text. In fact, what Jesus says is quite hard to translate into English. He sort of says this. He says, "Didn't you know that I was in the things of my Father?" That's just sort of a better translation of that idea. Now, that doesn't work so much in English. That's a bit clunky. So the translators have helped us a little bit by saying, well, he's in the temple, so he's in his Father's house. He's doing his Father's work. He's about his Father's business. So they've added a bit of a nuance in there to try and help us. But actually, literally, Jesus is sort of saying, I am in the things of my Father. Right? So in other words, and this is really important, when we see that, the next bit of the story then is really powerful because the decision Jesus makes to grow intentionally is out of this revelation that he's in the things of the Father. The two things are connected. So he's not just a random thing, oh, and Jesus decided to grow. It's not a random statement. It's flowing through this passage. And we've had Jesus in the temple going, I've got an understanding. Now, we're not quite sure what all of that means, how much he understood at this stage, how much he had an insight to his own identity, or what it all meant. But he's saying something at 12, just about to become a man in the culture of a Jew. And he's saying something at 12 that is quite profound. He's saying, I've got an idea of what the Father wants for me. And I'm in that. I'm making a journey into that. With that understanding of purpose, he makes decisions to grow. Now, I don't want to contradict what I said earlier on, that growth is a decision, because I believe that categorically. That's why I started with that idea. But there's no doubt about it, a sense of direction and purpose will empower the growth process. So that's step back from leadership even, and just think about me as a disciple. If I get a sense as a disciple that my purpose is to follow after Jesus, my purpose is to honor Jesus in every area of my life, that purpose starts to dictate to my growth processes. It literally starts to challenge me on areas I need to grow in or change in just to fulfill that idea of being a follower of Jesus. So when I became a Christian, it became pretty obvious to me and pretty apparent to me, if I'm going to be a follower of Jesus, I've sort of got to take the Bible more seriously. All right? I can't just leave that on the bedside cabinet like from one Sunday to the next and rely on the preacher to sort me out. Even as a youngster, I sort of worked this idea out that if I'm going to follow Jesus, I've got to get into the book that talks about him and through which he talks about me. And so you could say in a context like that, that literally shaped my growth. a clarity on my purpose, which at that stage, I had no purpose to do this. I had no idea I'd be doing stuff like this. If you'd have said to me as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old young man, what's the purpose of your life? I'd have said, just survive school. Let's just get through my exams and get this over with and see where we go. I had no great grand dream of world domination and change. It was sort of survival was my dream in the context of Belfast. But what I did have at that moment was a direction as a disciple. Now, we got to help people we're discipling, because just dumping ideas on them without direction, dumping ideas on them without a sense of purpose is not always helpful. So we don't just want to tell disciples what to do, we want to tell them why. Here's why we do this. Here's why we love the Bible in Westside. Here's why we worship Jesus in Westside. Here's why we gather in community groups in Westside. Here's why. Not just, hey, get into a group. Hey, read your Bible. Give them why. I found this with my own kids. They need a why. They don't just need a what from me. Hey, Beth Ann, you need to read your Bible. She sort of knows that because she's in a church community. She needs a why to read her Bible. And actually, I think that's what's going on in Jesus. And that's a powerful idea in growth for us, even as leaders. We mustn't underestimate that in the power of just basic discipleship, but we mustn't underestimate that in the power of our own journey. The clearer the sense of direction for you as a leader, a spiritual leader, the more it will empower your growth journey. And some of you have experienced that in your careers and in your lives generally, where you've had a clear sense of this is what I want to be, and as a result, it's really focused your development track. It's a bit like that here. Jesus isn't just randomly growing. He's growing for purpose. He's not just growing on purpose, he's growing for purpose. Does that make sense? The second idea is we sort of need a plan. It's good to have a purpose, but I'm a great believer in process. I've grown up in a Pentecostal church, and in Pentecostal churches, we love the big boom moments. God turns up and zaps you. Boom, zap, fixed. Now, I believe in all that stuff still. So I speak in tongues every day. I am filled with the Holy Spirit in a book of Luke and book of Acts sense. I'm absolutely committed to a life of the Spirit. But I also believe that process is part of that life. So I believe in those dynamic moments where God can zap you and fix you and revolutionize you. And we must keep opening ourselves up to that. But I see in a Bible worldview this marvelous tension between the big dynamic fix me moments and also the everyday boring routine mundane process moments. And in the life of Jesus, most of his life is made up with just process. And people don't like the word process. It sounds a bit boring. It's not as exciting and dynamic as those big zap moments of Jesus when he just touches you and changes everything. But if you look at the big zap moments of your life, there's normally big gaps in between them. You don't get zapped every day. You couldn't stand it. And you couldn't go to work every day if you got zapped. Actually, most of my life and your life is made up of routine, ordinary. Sometimes, can I say it, maybe even in Canada, boring. But that's where God lives. God doesn't just live in the zap moment. God lives in the boring moments. God's not just with me when I'm on a stage like this. He's with me when I'm walking the dogs. I have 2 dachshunds, sausage dogs. They would not like the snow. Low riders. It's just not going to happen. I would open the door. They would look at the snow and go, "Are you on drugs? There's no way I'm going out there. That ain't happening." Low riders, their little legs just scraping a lot. My goodness, can you imagine what a dachshund would do in Canada? It would just die. And my sausage dogs are called Pepperoni and Salami. That's the names of the dogs. Now listen, I believe the Lord, I don't want to sort of trivialize this. I believe the Lord is with me when I'm walking my dogs. I believe the Lord is with me when I'm in the gym. I believe the Lord is with me when I'm having dinner with my family. So if I only see God in the big zap moments, I'm reducing God's influence in my life to these big spectacular crisis moments, which produces a fairly brittle faith. I believe in those big moments. But I also believe in the everyday, ordinary, routine, breathing in and out, doing all the stuff you got to do, and doing it well. Do you know what I've discovered? I've discovered that the most extraordinary people I've ever met are not just like brilliantly talented people in that sort of sense, like outstanding people. The most extraordinary people I've ever met are people who do ordinary things really well a lot. The difference between ordinary and extraordinary is extra. It's not brilliance. It's normally just extra. And when nobody was looking in the world of Jesus, he was doing extra. That's what makes Jesus stand out. It's not because he's God. Hey, I've got the advantage. I've got the jump on everyone. I don't need to learn and read and write. I invented Hebrew. I don't need to learn the Bible. I wrote the Bible. But Jesus doesn't permit himself shortcuts. Because there's no shortcuts to anywhere that's worth going in life. You know, maybe to the supermarket, but not in life, do you know? So Jesus has a plan. The plan is very, very simple, but it's profound. He grows in 4 key areas: wisdom, intellectual growth, stature, physical growth, favor with God, spiritual growth, favor with men or humans, emotional growth. Look at that. Spiritual, intellectual, physical, emotional. That's a pretty cool plan, right? I mean, even if you didn't know your purpose, but you and I made a commitment to grow in all of those areas, that's really a spectacular idea. But I want to argue with you that Jesus grows in those areas because it's part of the direction he's going in. That may look different for you, and it might look different for me, and that's fine. But I'm showing you that Jesus didn't just randomly or supernaturally turn up at his baptism at the age of 30. He got there because of this. Because when nobody was looking, and there was no excitement, no band on the stage, and no fantastic atmosphere, he got up every day in boring old Nazareth, and he did this. So when everybody was looking at him, he was ready to go. I love this. I mean, this is absolutely grabs me. I love the fact that I can grow in the boring. I can grow in the mundane. I can grow in the routine. I can grow in the ordinary. I love the fact that God is as invested into the ordinary as he is into the spectacular. And when I see that, it transforms the ordinary. So in reality, nothing then is really ordinary if you're allowed to bring this idea into it. Everything is filled with opportunity, potentially, without overcooking that idea. So Jesus grew in wisdom. I would say this, that nothing is taught until it is learned, and nothing is learned until it is lived. So what we're talking about in wisdom as spiritual leaders is not simply the accumulation of knowledge, but the understanding of wisdom that then is worked out in our lifestyle. So in a biblical world, to hear something, and you'll see this in the New Testament and the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, there's a beautiful word, shema, which means not just to hear technically, but to hear and obey. How do you know you've heard God when you use the word shema? It's because you do what you've heard. So if you're a parent, you know the word shema without knowing Hebrew. If you're a parent, you know that there are moments when your children listen, but they don't hear. Yes? They've listened to the words, but they haven't heard. Maybe that's clearly just in my house. You're all looking at me like that's strange. So that's just in my house where I have children who listen but don't hear. How do I know my kids have heard something? They do it. Jesus says, in fact, you've probably been touching on this in your series, Discourse in the Parables. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. It's a weird expression, isn't it? But what he's really driving at there is, if you're really hearing it, which his audience would understand that concept, because he was probably using Shema in the context of his own language. If they really get what I'm saying, we'll know because they'll do something about it. So as spiritual leaders, we're not just committed to the accumulation of knowledge. We are committed to wisdom. Wisdom that works its way through in our lives. And again, I think that the journey you're on is about exposing a leadership community to wisdom, whether that be through in-house development or by exposing this community to outside voices. But it's about exposing us to wisdom that can move from a piece of information into something that is ultimately lived out in our everyday experience. Jesus grew physically. We don't tend to think of the physicality of Jesus. In fact, most Renaissance art presents Jesus in a sort of a more, forgive me ladies, but I think it's a fair indication, they present Jesus generally in a more effeminate form than a masculine form. Jesus was supremely fit. Next month, because it's March, in April, my wife, myself, my oldest daughter and her husband are going on a holiday to Israel. And we're not really doing like the super religious stuff. We're going on something called the Jesus Trail. It's a walk from Nazareth to Capernaum. It's a 62-kilometer walk. And it tries to track the walk that roughly people in the days of Jesus would have done. Now, there's cool kibbutz and hotels on the route, and coffee shops. I know Jesus didn't like stop at a Starbucks on the way to Capernaum, but they've got to help tourists like us. But the idea is this. Here's an amazing idea. You read in the Bible that Jesus went from Nazareth to Capernaum. That's like 41 miles on foot. Like not in an air-conditioned car. To go from Capernaum to Jerusalem, it's roughly the guts of 100 miles. So when it says that Jesus went up to Jerusalem, we just read that and it's like, yeah, just had a little stroll. But that's representing a few weeks of travel. And when you track the life and ministry of Jesus through his journeys, through his fasting, through his sufferings, supremely fit. Now, what Dr. Luke is telling us that he's not just fit because he's God, he's got some level of physicality in his world because he's paying attention to looking after it. Now, can I just say that your physicality is part of your spirituality? Now, what I don't mean by that is we all have to run an ultra marathon or we all have to, be size 0. That's not what we're talking about because I want to encourage you to think well-being rather than waist size. If you're driven by waist size, you'll never be healthy. It's the wrong purpose. Be driven by well-being. I want to be well. I want to be well enough to do what Jesus wants me to do. I want to be well enough to do a good job for my job. I want to be well enough to serve my wife or my husband. I want to be well enough to serve my children. I want to be well enough to serve my church. That's my motivation. So my motivation is not to be sort of super fit. My motivation is to be well and to take care of my physicality. Because here's what I've discovered. Whether I like this body or not, it's the only one I'm getting. I can't trade it in. This is it. So I've got to look after it. And the Lord has blessed me with some measure of health. So I want to be a person taking that seriously. Is that okay? I don't want to offend anybody. But at the same time, I do want to challenge us. That is, as followers of Jesus and as leaders, part of our leadership is in our physicality. We want to take our physicality seriously. Not to worship it, but so that it can serve the purpose of God in our lives as effectively as is possible. Make sense? Okay. Quickly moving on. We're almost there. He grows in favor with God spiritually. And it's coming back to the idea we started with today. We are spiritual first, leaders second. So in other words, I am called, before even I'm being called to lead you, I'm being called to engage with the Lord. I'm being called to walk with him. And so for me, one of the things I try to do when I'm coaching young leaders and trying to lead myself is that I want to really build a strong spiritual vibrancy within our lives. That actually, it's my relationship with the Lord that is going to determine everything. And we'll talk about this afternoon after lunch, but if it hadn't have been for the depth of my relationship with the Lord, I probably wouldn't be here today in terms of my own life and ministry journey. So it wasn't sort of my ministry portfolio that's got me here. It wasn't the badge that I'm wearing or my network. It's the depth of that connection with the Lord that has actually carried me through some of those profoundly difficult moments. And Jesus grows in relationship with God. He learns the voice of the Father. He learns to know what the Father wants. He says in John's Gospel, I only do what I see the Father doing. Now, lazy answer, well, it's because he's God. Lucan answer, because he grew. So me and you can grow in our relationship with God. We're not looking for utopia. We're not looking for perfection. We're just looking, come on, today, let's grow a little bit further with the Lord. Let me be intentional. Let me cut a path to allow the Lord and me to make some connection. So let's go back to our idea of growing deliberately. Then the challenge on me is to make sure I'm doing some deliberate stuff to help this area of my life develop and grow in the midst of my busyness and my demands. And then lastly, of course, we're growing in favor with people. Whatever your personality type, and there are people in this room super comfortable. I think Bobby has said, he would see himself as an extrovert sort of person, loves being around people, loves engaging with people. Others in the room wouldn't be so comfortable with that. So there'll be a range of that in our world. The challenge to all of us is that people are our business. It's not business that did our business. It's people are our business. And I have a theory that actually every ministry has to have the smell of sheep on their clothes. Sheep. Yeah, sorry, pronounce that properly. Bah, sheep. How do you say it? Sheep. Yeah, that's what I said, sheep. Okay. So once you lose that smell off you, it means you're not really hanging around the sheep long enough. And once we get detached from people, we get a wee bit dangerous. So Ephesians 4:11 ministry gifts: apostle, prophet, pastor, teacher, evangelist. All of them thrive around people. Once they start to cut themselves away from people, they become different. And actually, it's that idea. I remember sitting with an old man of God who was building a great church. I was about 21 years of age, and he said to me, son, never lose the smell of sheep off your clothes. I love that. Never forgot that. And actually, as a leader and a teacher, sometimes I'm wanting to pull away. But I'm trying to hear this call, that my call is to serve people, and therefore I can learn about people. I can become better with people. Now, believe it or not, and you may not want to accept, but I am an introvert by personality. So like I sat on the plane coming here to Calgary, the man sitting beside me didn't want to talk, and I'm cool with that. So we shared a plane for 8.5 hours, and apart from saying hello and a few little pleasantries to sort of probe him out, did he want to talk? And I worked out, no, he doesn't. We didn't talk. And because of my personality type, I'm cool with that. Had he wanted to talk, once I get started, I can talk for England. But here's my challenge. My natural default would be, I don't want to talk to you. All right? So that's my natural personality. I've had to train myself. I learned that personality type is preference, not prison. A lot of people make their personality a prison. Oh, this is the way I am. And I get that. but I've learned that personality type is preference. So I am fundamentally an introvert, but I've learned to be a bit more extrovert. I've tried to learn about people. Do you know why? Because people's our business, and I can't do my job as a teacher if I cut myself off from people. Because teachers are not just about the Bible and books. Teachers are about people. And I don't teach well if I cut myself off from people. Are you with me? So see your personality type not as a prison, but as a preference. It's where you go if no one puts pressure on you. It's where you sit if you've got your own control. You know, if I can, I'd be just happy with a book or watching a movie and not be bothered with anybody. That's my preference. But I can't live there. If I live there, I'll not be the person God needs me to be to minister to his world. But that's the tension we've got to manage. Does that make sense? All right, we're going to finish with this, literally landing this. And it's this. The third thing about growing for purpose is it just requires a bit of persistence. I don't know if you noticed in our text, but there was a massive idea tucked away in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is 12 years old at the temple, and he is 30 years of age when he's baptized. So we have 18 years of silence, 18 years of nothing. Something, but we don't know what the something is in intimate detail. We can patch it together. We've got an idea. We can come up with some thoughts and theories. But actually, if you just followed the Luke story, we've no idea what happens in that gap other than this. In those 18 years, Jesus grew. And so what Dr. Luke, if you're following the breadcrumbs with Dr. Luke, following the code, here's what he's saying. Jesus didn't just arrive at the River Jordan because he was God. He arrived at the River Jordan because he grew. Now, he could have arrived because he's God. But that would have been a denial of the very idea of incarnation. It would have been a denial of the very idea of God becoming one of us and living with us and being like us and being a high priest who ultimately, literally is touched by our own vulnerabilities and our own infirmities. So Jesus doesn't draw on his godness. He instead grows in his humanity. And so when he stands in that Jordan, the Holy Spirit comes, the Father speaks, zap, moment. Everyone goes, wow, love a moment like that. Can I have one? Can we get in the queue for the Holy Spirit and the Word of the Father? Everyone wants the baptism moment. Nobody wants to talk about the 18 years of silence, where Jesus did most of his growing. He does 91% of growth for 9% of ministry. 3 years of ministry built on a looking story of 18 years of growth. Wow. What an idea. So when he stands at that river and heads off to change the world, he's doing so because he has committed himself to growing on purpose, growing for purpose. He literally cuts a path. And my big takeaway from this is if Jesus can grow, even though he's God and he doesn't draw on his godness to grow, if Jesus can grow, I can grow. If Jesus can grow in Nazareth, I can grow in Gloucester. If Jesus can grow in a world that didn't get him at all, did not get him at all, and it wouldn't be till after the resurrection the dots would start to connect and people would start to really get him. He lived most of his life in a world that did not get him, and yet he grew. And I go, if he can do that, as a man, if he can do that, I can do that. And it's empowered me, encouraged me that every day is a growth opportunity towards the purpose of God for my life, whatever it is. And I have found that to be tremendously liberating and empowering and affirming on my journey. And I commend that to you, This church wants to create an ongoing environment of learning and growth and development, not simply to make us cleverer, but hopefully to make us better and bigger so that we can serve each other and serve our city and maybe beyond for the glory of God. Amen?